All right, welcome everyone. Yesterday we had a discussion on disease causation models. The aim of that presentation was basically to let you know that it is not very possible commonly to have only one factor responsible for the occurrence of a particular disease, either in a population or in an individual. So there is always an interaction of several factors, and we dwelt a lot on concepts that relate, or the models that relate to models that explain the multifactorial nature of disease causation. So we basically looked at the web of causation model. We looked at social determinants of health. We looked at what we call the socio-ecological model of disease causation, and many other things. And we can use these models basically to think about what causes diseases in a population in a more broad way, such that we can make decisions on where to focus our resources. Okay, so today's discussion basically follows that discussion, and it is basically focusing on causality. Okay, how do we make a decision to say that the occurrence of cancer in an individual is linked to smoking or is linked to genetic factors? How do we make that connection? Okay, and for us to be able to make that connection, I think it is very important that we focus on one of those models that we looked at yesterday and remind ourselves of what is entailed in that model. And that model is basically the sufficient causal model of disease causation. So we are going to look at it first before we go to the criteria that we can use for in determining causality, or in what we call causal inference. How do we say that A causes B? What should be there for us to say A causes B? Okay, that smoking leads to lung cancer, for example. That is the discussion that we are going to have. Okay, so moving on, let us first explain what causality is. In simple terms, we are talking about a particular factor, either circumstance or condition or characteristic or exposure that is linked to a particular health event. It can be a disease. It can be a fall, for example. It can be anything that basically impacts on health, okay, or an individual's health. So the relationship between that factor, which we have called several names, and the occurrence of that event, which could be someone getting cancer, someone getting hypertension, someone getting a fall, someone getting a road traffic accident, or whatever event that we are talking about. So usually when we talk about those events, we use the word health outcome. Okay, so I'll be using the word health outcome several times. When I'm using that word, I'm basically referring to a health-related event that we are linking up with the other factor. Okay, so when we talk about causality, we have two things. One causing the other. So one is the factor, the other is the event. Okay, so that is what we want. Why are we very interested in this? We are actually very interested in this because if you don't know what causes what, then how can you design preventive interventions? You can't. If you don't know that exercising is linked to improving heart health, then you cannot encourage people to do exercise. Okay, if you don't know how to link high-fat diet with the cardiovascular disease, then you're not going to tell people to eat healthy foods. Okay, so it is very important to know the exposure and the health event that is linked to these exposures, and then be able to design interventions. But along the way, we'll realize something, that you see, if you are going to say that someone who does not exercise is likely to get a cardiovascular disease, you could be right, that is true. But again, what if it is the cardiovascular disease that is making people not to be able to exercise? What if it is the other way around? Okay, so sometimes our explanations for certain inferences that we make are not accurate. So that is where you have issues to do with biases, issues to do with confounding, and sometimes with what we call modifiers, or some factors modifying the effect. Okay, and you need to take into consideration those aspects. So for you to make a conclusion that A is linked to B, you need to be very sure that there are no biases, that you have really taken into consideration what we call confounding factors that we will look at in subsequent presentations. Okay, so we are interested in causality because it is the basis for us to design public health interventions that can improve population health. If we don't know what causes one, then we cannot design effective interventions. And they are also making decisions. Okay, you can have several exposures for a particular disease. Okay, let us say hypertension is linked with several risk factors. Inactivity, poor diet, it could be issues to do with the genetics, it could be a number of factors. Okay, so which of these factors are you going to focus on? That decision is quite very hard, but if we know the extent to which a particular risk contributes to a particular health outcome, then it becomes very easy to make a decision on what you need to focus on. Okay, and this is basically very important for the growth of the public health knowledge or epidemiological knowledge sector, to really understand all these factors and how they contribute to health. Yes, so one of the myths that we have to demystify at this point is that, you see, it is not always that A causes B. It is not always like that. It is not always a straight line. As we looked at the web of causation last time, where we say, okay, someone can have several positive factors and several negative factors, and then but a disease can emerge, or the disease may not emerge in that person. So there are a lot of several interactions that will determine the outcome of interest, which could be by the occurrence of a particular disease. So yet in our lives we have always been told straightforward. For example, education is the key for success. See, without education, no success. But when you grow up, you realize that perhaps maybe there are other factors that play. Okay, the ability to learn very fast, the contribution of informal education towards one's success, the networks that these people could have. Okay, the number of years that people will have towards working to make sure that they are successful. Yet someone perhaps is concentrated in academics, and by the time they come, someone has already worked for several years. Okay, so there is never a straight line. Yet in our upbringing, the concept of that A causes B is what has always been taught to us. Okay, so that is an issue there. In epidemiology, that is never the case all the time. Okay, it can be the case for some situations. Okay, if you, for example, in genetic diseases, okay, there is a gene that is missing, and that gene is responsible for this. And when that gene is missing, you're not going to have this. It is a straightforward thing. But most of these diseases that we deal with, even cholera, even malaria, even hypertension, diabetes, they are not straightforward. Okay, so that means that this A causes B thing is not really sufficient to explain the occurrence of these conditions, whether in individuals or populations. So it is basically the recognition that several factors play interact for a disease to happen in a population or in a particular individual. So even the mosquito bite that transmits the parasites that cause malaria, there are several factors in there. Okay, it could be the susceptible host factors, whether they are incompetent, whether they are exposed to these for a long time because of their nature of work. It could be several factors. It could be a physiological state, pregnant women. It could be children. Okay, so it could be factors associated with the parasite that we're talking about. Maybe it is developing, it is becoming more virulent, it is becoming pathogenic. Okay, so we have a lot of factors. By the time you get this malaria, there are a lot of factors that are in play. So we are moving from the argument that A causes B. We are saying no, it is not always the case. You can have D, E, F, G causing B. Okay, that's where we are moving in terms of argument. Now let's focus more on one of the models that we looked at yesterday, and that is the sufficient causal model. You can call it the sufficient component cause model. You can call it that. In this presentation, I've already referred to it as the sufficient cause model. So it still builds on the idea that a disease is not caused by only a single cause. There are several factors in play. And what we actually have to call a cause in this case is when we have the complete set of conditions. Remember previously I talked about conditions, exposures, characteristics, okay, that have to be in place in order for the disease to happen. So when we call what we call a cause in relation to this model is that we should have all the conditions, all the sets of conditions for a particular disease to happen. So by the time the person gets malaria, all the other component causes should be available. So it's basically what we are basically referring to as the sufficient cause. Okay, the sufficient cause, the complete set of the conditions that guarantee that the disease will happen. Okay, but not always a disease. Okay, though I'm actually using the word disease, and in epidemiology the word disease actually covers a number of things. We can use the word disease, or we can use the word health related events or health outcomes. So the word disease is used more broadly in public health and the epidemiology. So it could be an injury, it could be disease, it could be something else, as long as it is related to health. Okay, so a sufficient cause is when you have all sets of conditions in place. That basically the word sufficient is very key. That if you have them, then the disease will happen. Okay, it will guarantee, you are guaranteed that the disease will happen. And then the component cause is that okay, we are really recognizing that for a disease to happen, there are several factors that have to be there, and those individual factors are the ones we call the component causes. So that is that. So you can see this puzzle here that if you have not really aligned to have at least one color in any of the sides of this, then the disease will not happen. Until you have one color on each side, then that's where the disease is going to happen. So that's what we are saying in terms of sufficient cause model. Sufficient cause is when you have everything aligned properly, and then you're very sure the disease will happen. Okay? So in this example, this basically goes on to illustrate this point quite well, and we are saying that the condition, which is the disease in this case, is represented by U. But that U to happen, there should be several other factors which we are calling conditions or component causes. So component causes are A, B, C, and D. Okay, if you have them in sufficient combination, then U will happen, which is the disease. Okay, so it does not always mean that A, B, C, and D should always be available for U to happen, for the disease of interest to happen or to manifest. This is very key to note. Okay, so in this example, we are saying that if a person is moving and then they slide and fall, there are several issues that you can point out that could have really caused this. So you think about the floor being slippery, and you can think about the weather being icy. You can think about not having rails. You can think about the path not being very clear. So there are several factors. So each factor is what we call a component cause. Okay. So if you have all these factors combined, resulting into a disease, okay, or an event, which is in this case is a fall, and then you basically have the sufficient. You're guaranteed that indeed the fall will happen and you get a hip fracture. Okay, but sometimes you really don't know, and in epidemiology it is very important to have that. The knowledge that you don't know that another factor really existed is also very important. You never have it all. You never know it all. So there are other factors that could have played a role, but you are not aware about. What if the fall is physiologically induced? Okay, and here we are talking about rails, what the person is putting on the footwear. We're talking about the weather and then the slippery floor. What if the person was actually hypoglycemic? Okay, and because they are falling on the steps, you think they slipped, but the fall could have been initiated because they are hypoglycemic. Okay, so it is also very important to note that sometimes you don't know some of the factors. Okay, so still you don't need all the factors to be present for the event to happen. So not all component causes are really necessary for the disease to manifest. Okay, that is very, very important to note. And then we have what you call complementary factors. Complementary factors, this is when you look at other component causes that perhaps you're not considering, but they can really contribute to the event of interest. And the example of hypoglycemia can be a complementary issue. Or another pathologic issue, it could be whatever it could be. It could really complement on the occurrence of this. So if you're looking at other factors, also think about other factors that you might not have considered in your analysis. Okay? So for you, another understanding that you really need to know is the need for what we call a reference condition. Sometimes you can call it a referent for comparison. If you're saying that the person fell because there is no rail, okay, that perhaps they could have used to support themselves, having the rail alone may not be sufficient to explain the occurrence of the fracture because of the fall. Okay, the rail could be there but could be short. It could be there and not very strong enough to really support the person. So what we are saying here is that the absence of a cause does not necessarily mean that it could have prevented the effect. Okay, so you cannot say that because there was no rail, maybe the hip fracture would have really been prevented. Okay, or you can't basically say, if I can rephrase it again, that place did not have the rail, and the fall and the fracture could not have happened. That is not always the case. It could be there, but it may not have prevented the fracture. It's just like saying that thieves broke into your house, yet you have security guards. Okay, the thieves can break into a house where there are security guards. It can still happen where there are no security guards. Okay, so sometimes you will have the event happening even when what you suspected as the cause is actually available or absent. So still, the other example that we can use is the link between smoking and cancer. Not all people that actually smoke get lung cancer. That's very important to note. That means that smoking alone is not a guarantee for cancer to happen. Okay? There should be other parameters that you need to look into for you to really have that linkage being stronger. For example, saying that individuals who smoke this type of cancer have higher chances of getting, people who smoke this type of smoke have higher chances of getting this type of cancer compared to people who smoke another type. It could also be related to the frequency, how many cigarettes is someone smoking in a day, and is that correlating with the chances that they will actually get lung cancer. So these are things that you can really think about deeply. Also including how they actually inhale the smoke during the smoking. Okay? So that means that we must always have a defined alternative, which we are calling a referent, that not smoking at all or smoking less. How are they linked to the health event, which is lung cancer? Okay, so this is still going back to link out what we earlier on said, that you have the several factors at play in order to have the disease happening. Okay, so we have ways that we can use to determine whether A is linked to B. Okay, whether an exposure A is linked to a health outcome B. And in epidemiology, we usually use Bedford-Hill criteria and Koch's postulates. We talked about these two in our first lecture when we looked at the history of epidemiology, and here we are going basically to expand this further. So you can check the YouTube video on Introduction to Epidemiology, where we looked at Koch's postulate, okay, especially. So what is this Bedford-Hill criteria? What is this all about? So Bedford-Hill criteria is about establishing a link about causal relationships. Okay, causal relationships. The principle that how do we really say that A is linked to a disease B, that exposure to A is related to a disease B. Or, for example, we can pick one, and I will use this frequently in this section, the link between smoking and lung cancer. I will use that a lot to really explain this. So we have 9 principles, okay, that were established by Bedford and Hill. Okay, so let's go through them. We have experiment, consistency, strength of association, temporal relationship, dose response relationship, biological, plausibility, coherence, analogous as explanation, and then specificity. Those are the 9 principles, and I'm going to go through each one. So we start. The first one is strength. Okay, so we are basically saying with this principle, we are saying the more, or the relationship should be, if this is a graph, if I can illustrate this, let me illustrate this on here. Okay. This is the graph about exposure and the disease, the occurrence of a disease of interest. Saying that if, for example, you are a smoker, okay, or you have people who are smokers, and then you look at how many of these will actually develop lung cancer. If you have several people who are heavy smokers, the heavy smokers you are likely to have more lung cancer cases among heavy smokers than people who smoke less. Okay, so that means that there is the relationship. The more you increase the rate of smoking, the more you're likely to get more number of people who are having lung cancer. That is about strength. That the exposure increases the likelihood of the outcome, which is the health condition of interest or the health event that you're talking about. I guess that is very clear. If you have such a relationship, then that is, we are saying that the two, they're correlating, it is a positive correlation. So the strength of that correlation is what we are basically talking about. Okay, so if you have that, if the more you smoke, the more likely you get cancer, then it means the relationship between the exposure and health outcome is causal in nature. Okay, the second point is about consistency. Whether you test this amongst Asians, if you test it amongst Africans, if you test it among Europeans, among people in South America, you still get the same relationship. That is what we call consistency. Okay, so if you get the same thing in different groups, okay, even in different categories of population, subpopulations, it is most likely causal in nature. That is point number 2, consistency. And then specificity. The exposure should be associated with a specific outcome, not with many outcomes. Okay? It's basically saying that exposure E is linked to health event D, and not having exposure E causing another one F, another one G. No, we don't want that case. If you're saying the exposure is smoking cigarettes, and that smoking is linked to lung cancer, and that is the point that we are stressing here. Okay, so when it is linear, every time you're talking about this, it is linked to one particular issue, then that is better than if you have it spread out. Okay. Just going to the last. So we go to point number 4, temporality. So temporality is that if we are going to say, if you are going to say that put here, if you are going to say A caused D, I should have A before the D comes, before the disease comes. Okay, but if I get the disease and then later on I get A, I cannot say that the disease happened because of A. So that is an issue to do with the timing. Okay, if I've not been smoking and then I go to the hospital, I am diagnosed, God forbid, that I have lung cancer, and then after that I start smoking, you cannot say that the smoking caused the lung cancer, because by the time I started smoking, I had the disease diagnosed. Okay, so that is temporality. So it is an issue to do with time. And then biological gradient. Biological gradient is the more you are exposed to something, and the more likely you get it. If you have that situation, then that basically means that the more you're likely to have the relationship being causal in nature. Okay? Okay. So we have what we call infective dose. I'm just using this infective dose, that you see, if you're exposed to microbes, if they are not in sufficient numbers, you may not get the disease. But then, if you're exposed to sufficient numbers, then the disease can really happen. That also basically relates to this, that if the exposure is less, then the chances of developing this disease may not happen. But if you increase the exposure, then the more likelihood that you have this disease happening, then that means that the relationship is causal. Okay, still it goes back to our graph that we had earlier on. Here, for biological gradient is still, if you have the dose, the response is still like that. Okay, if you have that kind of graph, then that is likely to be causal. And I'm using the word likely very much because you may not really know what other physiological parameters are determining it between mediating factors. Okay, it could be through a pathway that you really don't know. Okay, and then you see the outcome. So seeing the outcome or the response because of this does not necessarily guarantee that it is this that caused it directly. It could be through another pathway. That's where modifying factors come in. That's where issues to do with mediating factors come in, and other modifiers or confounders that we shall look at. Plausibility. Okay, plausibility. This is basically meaning that, okay, you're saying this causes that, it is believable. Okay, it can be explained scientifically. If it cannot be believed scientifically, then it is not plausible. Okay, so this is to say that, okay, yes, I don't know that A causes B, but when you reason it that way, I believe you. That means that the reasoning is plausible. Okay, so if you talk about a particular factor causing a particular health outcome, and then you explain it, and then I believe it, I will say yes, that reason is plausible. Okay, that means that yes, biologically that can really happen, or scientifically that is believable. It is very reasonable. That is about plausibility. A coherence. Okay, usually of course people can make statements that are not really backed by science, so you really question that, like, but scientifically I'm not sure whether you're talking about is really right. Okay, so if the explanation is not existing in the literature, in the scientific literature, then you really have to question yourself so much. But if someone provides an explanation that A causes B, and when you read the literature points in that direction, then it is believable, than if the person says this causes that, and you check, there is nothing whatsoever that points in that direction. So it means it is not really coherent with all scientific literature. Experiment. In science, we are interested in reproducing experiments. If you say that A causes B, and you said that you tested it in the laboratory, you introduced this exposure to a rat, and then the rat developed this. Regardless of where I'm staying, if I repeat what you did, and I find out that it is indeed that, I reach the same conclusion like yours, then I'm likely to believe you than if it's just hearsay. Okay? So experimental evidence is another criteria. Analogy. Okay? The association should be similar to other known causal relationships in different domains and contexts. Okay? If you say, in this case, if you use this example, if you say A causes B, if there is another factor C that is similar to A, then that C should also lead to something that is also similar to B. Then that is what we call analogy. If there is something like that, then yes, you are likely to be believed. Okay, so let's go to Koch's postulates. Koch played an important role in the study of bacteria. Okay, he determined that he's actually credited for what we call the causal theory. I mean the germ theory. Okay, he's credited for the germ theory. That means by that time, people had different theories on what causes diseases. We had the miasma theory, and then we have theories related to the environment, water and air, that is through Hippocrates. So these were the prevailing theories then, okay, about what causes diseases. So by the time Koch came up with the fact that we have microorganisms responsible for diseases, it was time when there was a lot of uncertainty. Okay? So what did he say? He came up with principles that we call the Koch's postulates. Okay? And these principles are that if you are going to say that the microorganism is responsible for a disease, for a particular disease, if you get individuals who have that disease and you get, let us say, biopsies, and you test for whether those microbes are there, you should be able to get them. If you're saying tuberculosis is caused by mycobacterium tuberculosis, if you take specimens, let us say sputum, and test for mycobacterium tuberculosis, you should be able to get it. That is principle number one. And you should not be able to get it in people who are healthy. And then the other thing is that you should be able to obtain that microbe out of the diseased organism. In this case, we can use cultures, we can use even the blood that is taken for microscopic viewing. It means that you should be able to see those microbes there. And even if you want to culture them, you can culture. That means if you are going to say that this microbe is responsible for this disease, it means that in all people who have that particular disease, you should always get that specific microbe. You don't have to get another microbe. Okay? And then the last one is that the microorganism must be re-isolated from inoculated disease experimental host and identified as identical. Even if you get the sputum that contains the mycobacterium tuberculosis, and then you inoculate that in a living organism, let us say rat, the rat should be able to display. If the microbacterium tuberculosis actually attacks the rat should be able to display signs of infection. Okay. So where do we apply that? Coaches postulates are related more to infectious diseases that are caused by infectious agents or microbes, whether it is bacteria, viruses, and the rest. Talking about tuberculosis, HIV, hepatitis B, cholera, anthrax, leprosy, and other many infectious diseases. So the challenge is that we can only apply Koch's postulate in infectious diseases. You may not really apply them to non-communicable diseases. Okay? That's the challenge with his work. But generally, in assessing causality, because in the epidemiology, there are a lot of things that are going to be emerging. Even you see things in newspapers that you can see a story that says the rice has been found to contain a substance X that is linked to increase in cancer cases. Okay, so you will have that statement as a headline in the newspaper. When you get this newspaper, of course, it may not be written by scientists, but when you're reading that newspaper, you should be having a critical eye, what I can call the epidemiological eye, to be able to point out the weaknesses of that news article, to be able to point out the kind of, or if you get a research article linking a particular agent to a particular disease, you should be able to critically evaluate whether indeed the linkage is actually very valid or not. And that's what we are saying. You need to assess causality. So what do we look at? We look at what the extent of the strength and consistency, which we have looked at earlier on. You look at temporal relationship, which we have also looked at. And then biological plausibility, we have also looked at. Coherence, we look at that. Dose response relationship, check that. And then more broadly, how was the research conducted? Because evidence comes more from research. Evidence, high quality evidence comes from randomized control trials. So how were the randomized control trials carried out? So you ask yourself those questions. The nature of design, how were the participants recruited, how were confounding factors controlled, how were the statistical analysis carried out, sensitivity analysis, and potential effects of modifiers, how were they handled? So there are several questions that you can really ask yourself, and this will basically look at in subsequent sessions where we look at evaluation of epidemiological studies, such that if you read any epidemiological study, you can be able to say that this is rigorous, this is lacking, we have areas here, can you take the conclusions or you can't take them. So that marks the end of this presentation, where we have looked at causality, and we have noted that diseases may not have a single cause. You can have several factors. These several factors interact in various ways, but it's very important for us to know the relationship between different exposures and particular health outcomes. If we know this, then it is very important to you can use this for designing public health interventions. Okay. However, we should be able to know the link. How do we determine the link? There are certain modalities that we can use, criteria that we can use to determine whether this is linked to that. And we use the principle of precautionary principle, that okay, we may suspect that A is linked to B, but you're not very sure. But that doesn't mean that you don't really take care of A. Thank you.